Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Is it true that you can't sue a vaccine manufacturer? Is it really the case that if you get injured or suffer some side effect from a vaccine, that the vaccine makers are shielded from lawsuits? A lot of people we're hearing from seem to think so. They say it's one of the biggest drivers of their mistrust for public health today. They think this is a sign that the system is rigged. On this episode, we get to the bottom of it. What can and can't you do if you think you've been injured by a vaccine? Where does the system work and where does it fall woefully short? We ask a vaccine legal scholar. Let's get started. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
I'm Mark Abdul-Malik.
And I'm Tom Johnson.
You know how to order.
I know.
I know.
Changed it up.
Well, spicing things up today.
It says that I go second, so I was following the directions.
It's true. We do have like a little bit of an outline. Maggie just gave it away. We're not just this awesome naturally. But listen, today we want to get into an issue and we want to get right into it because this is complex stuff. Joining us today is Dorit Reiss, an expert on vaccines and the law and a professor of law at the University of California Hastings School of Law. Welcome, Dorit.
Hello.
Dorit is going to ride shotgun with us as we walk through the history of how we got here with our system to handle vaccines and what is the truth about whether vaccine makers are shielded from lawsuits when in those rare cases something goes wrong. Dorit, we're really glad you're joining us because, like we said, this stuff is kind of confusing. And then you add in a lot of bad information and misunderstanding out there. As you know, on the show, we hear from sort of regular everyday Americans who have lost trust in science and public health. And this issue about not being able to sue vaccine makers has come up in a lot of conversations. And I just wanted to start off by reading you a few texts I've gotten about this topic. So the first text says, the fact that vaccine makers can't be sued, that's one of the key items that made me lose trust during the pandemic when the COVID vaccine got the same deal. Another person I heard from said, as soon as the vaccine makers got immunity, the vaccine schedule blew up. I mean, of course, if you were the pharma companies, why wouldn't you add every vaccine you can when you can't get sued for it? And the third one, and she wrote me a long essay about this, you guys. I'm just reading a tiny little part, but she said, the most obvious concern with regards to not being able to sue pharma is that the incentive decreases for pharma to create a safe product since it has no financial risk on their end. No risk for pharma, big risks for children. And of course, all this is happening as, you know, this is a common talking point for Robert F. Kennedy, who's mentioned this numerous times in interviews. So we just wanted to get some clarity on this, you know, what's real, what's not. So Tom Johnson, the story, you know, it starts back in the 80s.
But yes, this starts back in the 1980s. There was a growing number of lawsuits brought against vaccine makers. They've been ticking up, especially zeroing in on the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus immunization. That's the DPT as it was known then. It's interesting, you know, I came across one Substack written by Paul Offit, who's a friend of the podcast, and a gentleman we just had on the show recently.
And a prominent vaccine
one of the major
expert.
voices in vaccination in America. And he traces it back, this surge in lawsuits against vaccine makers, especially around DPT. He traces it back to a 1982 and a local news documentary called DPT Vaccine Roulette, which really scared people. It got picked up and got a lot of media coverage, and it just sort of started a ball rolling. And you know, regardless of the documentary, there definitely were cases of rare side effects being experienced by families. Some of those would later demonstrate to not be related to the vaccine, but, you know, damage was done and people started suing more and more. And Paul points out that in 1980, there were 18 companies that made vaccines. And with only just a few years later, there were just a handful left that were making this vaccine. They were pulling out of the business. It was too dicey. It was too much of a Wild West. There was too many lawsuits flying. Insurance for them started to skyrocket. So 1986, Congress passes and Reagan signs into law something called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And it does a bunch of things, including setting up that adverse reaction reporting system that we know today. But it pretty quickly sets up something called the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And basically, and I want to toss it to Dorit to get her 2 cents on this, but basically, as far as we understand it, the program was designed to make it easier to compensate people, making claims that they were injured, but also providing a framework for how the vaccine makers can be held accountable. So Dory, do you want to just like give us just a thumbnail of how that program was set up to work?
Yes, so the way the program works, you start your claim in a unit in the Department of Health and Human Services. They can agree to your claim or disagree. If there's disagreement, it goes to a special master that sits in an agency in the Court of Federal Claims, so outside the Department of Health and Human Services, and gets litigated between the government and the claimant. And as you said, it's simpler than the regular courts. You just have to show that the vaccine caused your harm and that you had, and what the damages were, and the causation is even easier. And as you also said, it also sets a framework for accountability for the manufacturers.
Yeah.
In addition to the complaint about the lawsuit, there were also complaints from people about how hard it was to win in the courts. Most of these lawsuits lost. So that goes to this program is simpler. But vaccine manufacturers, instead of paying specific damages, now we're paying an excise tax on each vaccine. Today, it's 75 cents per dose of vaccine. And that went into a fund, and the government used that fund to pay people. So they weren't paying directly. They were paying just to the fund.
Yeah. And if you think about it too, you read these accounts of people who are trying to pull together a lawsuit, sue a major pharmaceutical company. Do they hire scientific, researchers to testify? I mean, just the burden on people, just enormous. And at the same time, if you believe that vaccine makers are making a product that we absolutely need, then you want them to continue doing that. And if they're starting to bail out of the business saying there's too much exposure here, there's just too many cases here and we're spending too much time fighting it in court, then I think you start to understand like why Congress and eventually the Reagan administration signs into law this new approach.
Right.
Dorit, is it something that's easy for people to do? I mean, do people know about it? Is it a process that, becomes overwhelming as you're going through, a side effect issue? How does it work, like practically?
So the answer is going to be a little complicated, and I apologize. First, in terms of knowledge, so when someone goes to be vaccinated under federal law, they have to be given a vaccine information statement. I'm not sure it's always done, but they're supposed to be. And at the end of that is information about the program. So in theory, people are given that form. We know that people don't always read form they get when they go to the doctor, and they might not keep it. So if a vaccine issue comes up a little later, they might not have that form. It's pretty easy to find online, but I will say that I expect that like most administrative programs, especially small ones, a lot of people don't know about it.
I've never gotten that form. I'm going to tell you that right now.
I've gotten it, like the huge ream of paper that you
Yep.
get. Yeah.
It's like all the fine print. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
it
get a
looks like fine
stack
print.
of
Yeah, I've gotten
Yeah.
it.
Besides, it's you're supposed to get it before you're vaccinated, unless it's a mass clinic. Then they don't have to give it, but they're supposed to give it to you. And if not, you should talk to your doctor because they really
I think it's because
should.
I go to CVS for most of my vaccines. So then
Yeah.
it becomes, if you're not going to your doctor, and I think a lot of people get vaccines from different places. But anyway, I just wanted to add that I haven't had that experience. But anyway, keep going.
So you should be getting that form. The program has been trying to increase attention to it. So they've been, for example, they came to my law school and gave a presentation. They're trying to have more people know. But the reality is that a lot of us don't know about a lot of administrative program or court process unless we have to deal with them. I mean, there's just too much for us to know. So people should know, but a lot don't. And as to your second question, I expect that for many people, any legal proceeding would appear overwhelming, especially if they're in a vulnerable situation, like they're hurting or someone they love hurts. So I
Yeah.
expect a lot of people see it as hard. Easier than the court isn't easy. You can get, and they encourage it, a lawyer to walk you through vaccine court. You don't have to, but you can. And the program covers your lawyer's fee and any cost. So that's an advantage. But I expect that many people would be saying, how do I do this? And there's a group of lawyers that specialize in this and can help people through it.
Right. And just want to underline like one of the big places where I think people sort of come off the wagon. You can still sue. You just have to go through this process first. If you don't like the result, you then can sue. Or if the process stalls out over a certain amount of time, then you are relieved of that and you can go out and sue. So I think that's just a big distinction, and just reading articles about this, it just gets shorthanded that, hey, this is a system set up. It gives a shield, a liability shield to the pharmaceutical companies, but in exchange, you have a compensation process. It's just not altogether clear that at the end of this, you absolutely can go ahead and sue. Isn't that right, Dorit?
That's right. As you said, you can go to the court either if you don't like the result or if it takes more than 240 days. I will give one qualification, which is there is one claim that under Supreme Court interpretation you can't take to the court, and that's a claim of what we call design defect. If you're saying it's not that the product was badly done, it's that the risks of the product outweigh the benefits, but you can go negligence, fraud, and other kinds of defect claims.
So let me again just recap what I'm hearing you say, which is if you get, say, a DPT vaccine and you think you're suffering from some sort of a side effect from it, right now, your best recourse is to go through this vaccine court where you can get a certain amount of damages. And in fact, the chances of you getting them or qualifying for them are quite high because the burden of proof actually is quite low. But a lawsuit is a different matter. And is it fair to say, Dorit, that in this case, and I think this really gets at a central point that a lot of the folks we speak to or worry about, which is, if you want some accountability, right? Does that amount that you're getting from the compensation court, would that be equal to some lawsuit amount? And is that fair to get one from one versus the other?
So from the point of view of the person compensated, they should be able to get the same damages. There are caps on the program for death and for emotional harms, but the economic damages are not capped. So if, for example, you end up in a wheelchair and you blame the vaccine, the amount should be the same in the program and in the court. And as you're saying, the program has less requirement. It's easier to win in the court. And I will add that in the court, the usual way we do it with lawyers get a contingency fee. So in the courts, the lawyer would usually get a 30 to 50% of whatever you're awarded, and that's not true in vaccine court. But there are caps. The program is, I think, good, but not perfect. It's a compromise. So if you think, for example, I want to get 3 million in pain and suffering, the program won't let you do that. Court might.
Yeah.
First of all, just want to make one point of clarification. So far, we're only talking about the traditional vaccines. This is all pre-COVID. And the COVID vaccine, we're going to talk about that a little bit later, has a separate program. But just at a high level, do you think this works? Do you think the program works?
I think it works. I think it's not perfect. So the US seems to tend towards being adversarial every time you have people arguing about something, and that somewhat goes into this program as well. It has backlogs. It needs more special masters. So it works reasonably well. It compensates a lot of people. It compensates them in terms easier than the court, but it's not perfect.
Yeah. I mean, these special masters, are they doctors? Are they lawyers? I mean, who's deciding who gets to be, I don't know if that word is a great word, but who gets to be the special master?
The special master is appointed by judges in the Court of Federal Claims, which they're not federal judges in the usual courts. It's an administrative agency, but they're judges appointed for 14 years, so a long time, with protection removal. So they're pretty independent, and the special masters are lawyers. One of the things they have that's an advantage potentially over a regular court is that they hear the same kind of cases over and over. So in this very complex area, they develop some expertise. If you read the decisions are very detailed, take the science very seriously, and have a good understanding of the science, not always, but most of the time. So they're lawyers that have been appointed for a term that can be renewed by independent judges.
And so far, and Dorit, tell me if we have this number right, over $5 billion has been paid out in compensation to people who've come through this program. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, we hear that number pop up a lot. A lot of people are looking back, finding that number and saying, you see, there's proof. These vaccines have historically been a train wreck. They've caused tons of damage. The companies have paid out $5 billion in claims. Like that, what else do you need to know that vaccines are dangerous? And that's not quite the whole picture, right?
No. So first of all, remember it's 5 billion over 30 years in which we've had millions of doses, hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines given for a long time. The program has a nice website in which they have vaccine compensation data, and then they show you the number of doses versus the number of compensation, and you see that for hundreds of millions of doses, the compensations are relatively few. And remember that one serious injury can cause millions. So over 30 years, 5 billion when serious injury, remember, it means you're supporting someone in a wheelchair who can't work, is millions. Isn't that high?
Yeah, I think instead of looking at it like a train wreck, it's really this program is about public health. And it says that because we know sometimes there are serious side effects or harm from a vaccine, the financial burden should be placed on society as a whole. And we're in this together. And because vaccines are critical for public health, we want to make sure that people aren't left hanging out there when things go wrong. And so those numbers end up being 1 in a million, depending on the vaccine, that might have a serious side effect. And then this is a mechanism to help with that.
Yeah, Maggie. I mean, the number, like, we hear 5 billion, and over that life of that program, it's like, I think it's like 30,000 people filed some sort of injury or death claim. So of all the doses that are out there, vaccines are being given in clinics across the world, but here we're talking about the US. 30,000 people are filing an injury or death claim. Around 40% of those, the special masters have weighed in and said, okay, this makes sense. This person did suffer a side effect. About 60% they dismiss. They say, no, I guess it didn't really meet the bar that you were injured. No fault, no fault was found and no money was paid. So these numbers of, 30,000 out of this, I don't know, millions and millions of doses. I mean, is it working if it as designed? I mean, we know as manufacturers and vaccines, we know that, like, you put it out, we think it's safe, but that's in just a small number of trials. But then when you put it out into the real world, of course, there are going to be people who have side effects. And, that's what this is for. But at the same time, people don't believe that. Like, where is the disconnect that, why do you need a program like this if vaccines are safe?
Maggie pointed out that we vaccinate for the public health, and the people who are the 1 in a million that gets the vaccine injury shouldn't be left hanging. Further, I think people will be more likely to vaccinate if they can trust that there will be that's big relatively, easy compensation. But as you always, the other thing that I want to highlight from your point, and you made a really good analysis of the numbers, is remember that most of those compensations are actually settlements, not decisions.
Yeah.
They're agreement between the government and the individual. And in most of those settlements, the government says, we deny causation, but we're settling because it's easier. It's not worth the fight. So the number of compensation is even lower. The number of decisions compensating is even lower than this.
So they don't admit fault, but like, here's some money, but we don't admit fault.
Exactly.
I mean, to one degree, Mark, some of the folks we speak with, I'd say they would point to the opioid epidemic where, a maker like Johnson & Johnson settled, where they didn't necessarily admit wrongdoing. And again, please tell me if I'm wrong about that. But there is, whether it's pharma or oil or whatever, big companies tend to settle. So again, I think that actually adds to the mistrust, quite frankly, that they'll throw money at fixing the problem. But maybe what I'm hearing Dorit say is that is a system of accountability that can help the consumer.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that for pharma companies, I worry that if this wasn't put in place, if instead of dropping to just 4 that were working on vaccines, if all of them would have dropped out. And I think it becomes a really integral part to protect the public, but then also to protect the innovation in the US. And it reminds me of, like, in the 2000s, this program in particular ended up being inundated by claims that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine caused autism. But that was all sparked by this completely discredited paper. And the program did its due diligence. It took on the data, it took on the studies, and concluded that no, the MMR vaccine did not cause autism. And those claims were subsequently denied, but it was really a test of the system. Dorit, how did you see that situation playing out? And do you see other ways in which it could have been handled better?
So I wasn't following vaccines yet at the time, but in hindsight, I think that the program handling of the autism cases was actually not bad except that it took years. So they started in 2002, and the first decisions were in 2010. So that's 8 years in between. The program let the plaintiff choose the first test cases. They went ahead with 6 of the cases rather than try to litigate thousands at a time. And they gave those 6 cases a very thorough hearing. I mean, it ended with decisions that were hundreds of pages that addressed the science, addressed each case, looked at the detail of each plaintiff, took all the experts seriously. And I think those decisions are powerful. They were challenged in appeal courts. So one of the things about the program is, in addition to being able to step out and go to a state court, you can also appeal those decisions to the federal circuit courts and up to the Supreme Court. So those were challenging the courts of appeal. And those challengers lost because the court says these decisions are very well reasoned. So I think we ended with good decisions on the autism front, but it took a long time.
Yeah. And it just to remind as we move to sort of the second part of the story, which is everything we've talked about so far are for the childhood vaccines, the standard vaccines, as well as some adult vaccines like flu, which were added into this. We're not talking about the COVID vaccines. So that's sort of now we're pivoting, right? So that was all about the standard stuff that kids get, adults get, and how to adjudicate, issues that arise with
Tom,
that.
that's a plot twist. That's a plot twist. COVID
And a whole
is
new
not
name,
included.
a whole new 4-letter
A
word.
whole new,
Oh,
it's a
man.
whole
I mean, I
new
got to be honest
program,
with
a whole
you.
new-
This is like tough to wrap your head around.
Well, we
man.
got through the first part. I mean, yeah.
You are great. You are great. Tom Johnson did a great job.
I'm saying like,
this
we
thing.
got it. We follow. I hope everyone's
following-
on board still.
We're following the
yeah.
bouncing ball, but I'm just saying I can understand,
Yeah.
why this is a lot to chew on. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, plot
Yeah.
twist.
All right.
COVID.
All right. Well, 2005, we passed a law sort of building off this compensation program. It's called PrEP, and it's Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. And it basically says in a public health emergency, companies that are making stuff for that emergency, whether it's treatments or vaccines or other things, will enjoy some protections from being sued. So again, if the Reagan era program covers child vaccines and like flu shots, this is going to cover vaccines in public health emergencies. So
Can I interject, Tom?
Yeah.
I'm just curious. So while it says that the companies can't be sued, is there language in there that instead the public health agencies or the government as a whole, or is it just like blanket?
Well, you're getting ahead of us.
I'm
Maggie.
sorry.
No, I love where you're going. But yeah, hopefully I think we have the answer to that, but Dorit will help us. So February 2020, right as COVID's hitting, HHS Secretary Alex Azar declares COVID is a public health emergency, and that kicks in this PrEP protections for Big Pharma. So that means companies like Moderna and Pfizer are protected from lawsuits regarding the COVID vaccines when the COVID vaccines start to roll out. It does set up a special process, similar to what we've been talking about, that will allow people who believe they were injured by the COVID vaccines to pursue compensation. And, there's a bunch of differences, though, between how PrEP is set up and the original Reagan era program that we've been talking about. I think it's really important that we sort of walk through this. Number one, in this case, for COVID vaccines or for emergency vaccines, it's nearly impossible to sue. Your recourse really is the program, entering a claim, making your case, and seeing it through. So number one, there really isn't at the end of the process, you can't jump out and say, I don't like it so much, I'm going to sue.
Hang on. Because that's big. That's big. So let's talk about that. Why is that? Dorit, what's going on here?
So what's going on here is remember, this isn't about vaccines specifically. It's about anything you make in an emergency. February 2020, it's not about vaccine because we didn't have any. It's about testing and the upcoming medicine. And the goal of this program is to say, in an emergency, manufacturers may well make mistakes as they're going, but we want more stuff out there rather than less. So we'll protect them more.
But now the emergency's been lifted. So does that mean that there's some like retroactive lawsuit stuff that can happen?
They've extended it.
They
Just
extended
in like
the
December,
PrEP declaration, not the emergency.
No, PrEP. They've extended this program has been extended for the time being.
And generally, they don't put in retroactive. You can't go retroactively. Yeah.
But Dorit, isn't the COVID vaccine now part of the childhood schedule and a recommended vaccine? So it sort of has one foot here, one foot there. How do you work it?
To get into the vaccine injury compensation program, it's not enough that it's recommended for children. Congress has to approve the excise tax on that vaccine, and it's up to Congress. So until Congress moves on COVID-19 vaccine, they can't move from one to another.
And so Congress have they even been asked to approve this excise tax? Like, how does that, or is this, we just don't have time for that right now?
People have been lobbying for it. As far as I know, there hasn't been a bill to do that.
Right. And it gets more interesting as versus the original program, this emergency program, there's a higher bar that you have to prove that your claim is real and that you were actually injured here.
So I guess it's desperate times call for desperate measures. Like right now we have an emergency situation, even though we've finished that phase of the pandemic, many would argue, but the vaccine injury program, all of the laws and the rules, they're still stuck in that phase and like at a time capsule back there.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're saying is it's actually a really interesting point. If you think about it, we're not in a pandemic emergency anymore, but yet we're still offering that shield, that liability shield to the vaccine makers for COVID.
Dorit, this one doesn't smell right, if I'm being honest. So tell me what you think. Like this one, if I'm skeptical of public health, like this makes me skeptical of public health. If that makes sense.
First of all, I think that the program was the wrong answer to start with. I think it's too hard. And even in an emergency, especially in an emergency, you want a fast, generous compensation program if you're giving this kind of liability shield. So I think from the start, we should have accompanied the liability shield with a much better program. So it was bad to start with, and continuing to bar people who have claims of COVID vaccine injuries from either the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program or the court is unfair. I think we're making a big mistake. I think you're right. It would increase mistrust, and it's unfair to the people who took the COVID-19 vaccine and had a side effect.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is that you think it should be just one claims, like one vaccine court, instead of these two courts where one burden of proof is suddenly made higher because of a medical emergency.
I think it would be a good solution to put everything under VICP, but you'd have to add more special masters because there's a lot more claims. If you do it now, it'll slow everything down and it won't help the people for compensation. You need to do both.
And the results have not been good. There was just a GAO analysis of the program, the COVID program. And it finds that only 25% of the claims have even been decided upon. And of the claims that have been decided upon, only 3% have resulted in compensation being handed out. And keep in mind, COVID's only part of this. This is H1N1 claims as well. But for COVID vaccine injury claims, here we are in 2025, only $400,000 has been paid out so far in compensation. So it's not worked. Dorit made the point it was probably not the right plan from the get-go. And the results, I think, are bearing that out.
And one thing it's harder, I think, for people to realize is that you have to act quickly. Like, with the regular vaccine injury program, you have, I think it's 2 or 3 years from the first development of symptoms. It's 3 years from when you first develop symptoms. But with the COVID program, it's 1 year from the shot. So if you had a shot and then 9 months later you figured out that maybe you have a vaccine injury, the clock has been running and you only have 3 months left to get your paperwork in. And that's hard. I mean, we met, I don't know if you guys will remember Daniel in our episode from before. Yeah. He, had some complications after the vaccine. And again, we don't know if it was from the vaccine or from COVID, but he missed the
chickenpox.
window, or chickenpox or whatever, but he missed the window, and he is no longer able to put in his claim. And, that's very frustrating for him, he says.
Dorit, when you look at all these pieces, right, there's lots of puzzle pieces here. What's allowed, what's not allowed. But ultimately, what would you say that you think works? And what would you say really doesn't work and needs to be changed? And that actually, if you were face to face with somebody who was like really skeptical of this whole system, where would you maybe see eye to eye with them?
I would see eye to eye with them on two things. First, I would agree that the way we are dealing with COVID-19 vaccine injury claims is inappropriate. It's not good enough. We're not compensating these people the way we should. We're not giving them a hearing the way we should. And we should completely change our approach there. I would also see eye to eye with that person in saying there are things we can improve and should improve for the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. We should be raising the caps. We should be adding special masters. Maybe we should be increasing the statute of limitation. So I think on those two.
What would your direct answer be when someone says, can you sue a vaccine maker? Or can I really hold a vaccine maker accountable for my injury that I think may have happened from a vaccine?
Two parts. Yes, you can sue a vaccine maker for a routine vaccine. You probably can't for COVID vaccine. You will have to go through the program first, but you can sue, and you may or may not win. Second, in terms of accountability, I think focusing on compensation and accountability in the same breath is a little tricky, because we have a lot of companies that are sued in tort, and it's not a great mechanism of accountability. They have ways to handle it. But vaccine manufacturers are subject to a lot of accountability mechanisms from other directions as well.
I think even though we're talking about vaccine injury and compensation and accountability, sometimes when you're so deep in this conversation, you forget it's not that we're saying the vaccines aren't safe. It's not that we're saying they're not effective, they're just too dangerous or too risky. No, it's that the vaccines do work, but as everybody acknowledges, there are some people who suffer side effects. And this is to address those people. I just want to, just make sure we hit that point that all of this doesn't mean that the vaccines are dangerous.
No, it doesn't. Seatbelts can sometimes cause an injury, but you're a lot safer with the seatbelt than without.
Yes, exactly, Dorit. That's a great example. I think that for me, when I look at the way this is handled, obviously it wasn't handled perfectly. We were in a pandemic, but we have a nice scaffold for this to apply to a lot of other things. And the fact that we have this robust data suggesting that people have been compensated means that the system is working, that we are trying to listen. And so how can we take that and apply it to COVID and other things that we move forward in public health in a way where people feel like they can trust that we're kind of showing them all of the data, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Dorit, I just have a question. We are on the verge of RFK Jr. likely becoming the HHS secretary. How much, if he chose to, in his powers as the head of HHS, how much could he erode the liability shield? Putting COVID aside, I'm saying now for the traditional childhood vaccinations, how much could he, is it like Jenga pieces? Could he pull one out and the whole thing starts to collapse?
So he could undermine it in one of three ways. And I'm going to start from what's hardest for him to do to the easiest. Hardest for him to do would be to take a vaccine out of the vaccine injury table. You take it out of the table.
So that means it wouldn't be covered anymore in this compensation program.
Exactly.
Okay.
But that would require going through rulemaking, and that there's probably going to be a lawsuit by the manufacturer, and they're going to have to show that it wasn't arbitrary and capricious to take it out. That's a high bar. Easier is to change the table of injuries. So you can show causation in the program in one of two ways: by showing that you have an injury already listed at the table that says these are the things the vaccines can cause in the time, then the connection is presumed, or by showing it independently. He can say, I'm revising the table of injury and say, adding autism as an injury from MMR. I'm telling the special masters that they have to presume that the MMR causes autism. He still would have to go through rulemaking, and he would still have to if it goes to court, he would have to meet the arbitrary and capricious standard, but it's harder to sue there because you'd have to have someone who has real standing to sue, and that's tricky.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that there's a legal path to saying that autism can now be?
No, she's saying, so just for the listener, this is all so standardized that there's literally like a chart, a table that says, this is the vaccine in this time frame. If you report these different side effects or these injuries, then the benefit of the doubt is that your claim is going to be paid out, that you're going to be compensated, and it's all like laid out in black and white. And I think what Dorit's saying is that as head of HHS, there would be a lower bar for that individual, in this case RFK, to add a new ailment to the list of accepted things that can happen because of
And
this
autism
specific
can
vaccine.
be added as that ailment?
He
Yeah,
can
how
try.
could-
So the secretary controls what goes into that table, but he has to go through the rulemaking process, and someone can say, you don't have any basis for making this change.
Got it. Okay.
And who gets to say that? Who would get to say you don't have basis for that?
So that's the tricky
Scientists?
thing here. You have to have someone who is standing to sue, so someone who's directly hurt by that. The problem here is that the manufacturers don't pay directly, so they can say, we don't think autism should be there, but they are not directly affected. So who's directly affected might be a barrier to suing. So there might not be someone who successfully sues there. And the
Something to
third
think
thing
about.
that we haven't mentioned yet
Yeah.
is, remember that the program starts with a unit in the Department of Health and Human Services that decides whether to concede a case or not. He can tell that unit, concede all cases, agree to pay everyone that makes a claim.
But that would bankrupt the whole program.
It might, depending how many people make a claim. But and I doubt he'd go to that extent, because among other things, his friends that act as lawyers from the program wouldn't be happy about that, because that would kill their job. But he could substantially make it easier to get a concession from the department.
So another thing that we've heard, and again, I think even RFK Jr. has attributed this quote to Ronald Reagan, and we haven't been able to find it ourselves, but maybe somebody else can find it and send it to us. But he's attributed this quote that when, initially when all this stuff started happening and they were going to put this kind of liability shield, or that vaccine makers were asking for this liability shield, that Reagan allegedly turned to them and said, why can't you just make vaccines safer? So my question is, do we also see another potential effect if Kennedy makes it? And by the time this episode comes out, we may know one way or the other. If he makes it, that it results in an increased sort of a safety burden of proof, by the way, that should already be at the highest. But is there a change we could see there? And I'm interested from Dorit and Maggie, what that could look like.
So from my point of view, we already have, as you said, very high standards for vaccine safety. We are very intolerant of even rare side effects. The thing is, if it works on your body, it's a little tricky to make it 100% safe. Either it works or it's 100, or it doesn't do anything. Usually it's not both. So 100% safety is probably inachievable. If I thought that Kennedy would go in and do things that would really make vaccines safer, I would be a lot less worried. But I suspect that that's not what's going to happen. I suspect he'll go in and do things that distort the information we have about vaccine and make them appear less safe without increasing safety.
Vaccines that we have today are safe and effective. There's no medical intervention out there or anything that doesn't have a risk benefit to its calculation, and vaccines are no exception. And that's why they have a nice table that does outline, Guillain-Barré syndrome is a good example that can be caused by one of the flu vaccines. And there's always the risk of allergic reaction because of how the human immune system works. So that's why anaphylaxis is always listed. And I think it's just so interesting, the statistics on it, because it's 1 in a million who might have a rare serious side effect. And those can be self-limiting too. Like think of myocarditis. The people who got diagnosed with that, it was mostly self-resolving, but then they would still qualify for these mechanisms. And
Is
so
it
it's
really 1 in a million, by the way?
for rare side effects from COVID vaccines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interestingly the same rate that the vaccine program is paying out, 1 for every 1 million doses.
Right.
But I mean, that's not the
Yeah.
COVID vaccine program, but the regular one.
And
It's
to
the
be
same
fair,
number.
they did discontinue the Johnson and Johnson vaccine because of side effects. So it's not like vaccines are perfect, as we know, but not
No.
far from it in some cases. But I think to your point about whether this can then kind of set in motion a series of steps that perhaps jeopardize safe vaccines that have met the bar, I think is a really interesting conversation. Tom, you had a point.
Yeah. So, Dorit, it just from listening to you, it seems like you are no fan of the PrEP program, the program that handles compensation and liability for the COVID vaccine. That it's not a headline here that 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 process and the lack of compensation is just driving mistrust, not only for public health, but specifically for how public health has had this relationship with Big Pharma, and the original program from the 1980s. Do you think it's hyperbolic to say that the ways in which the PrEP program, which handles the COVID vaccine, the deficient ways that that has gone down, might actually endanger the original program that covers all of our childhood vaccines? And if it endangers that, and that were to fall, and that liability shield comes down, that really could do some incredible damage to the entire vaccine industry in America.
I think maybe it won't be a direct pass, but we know that anti-vaccine people have been unhappy with the vaccine injury compensation program for a long time. They've had hearings about it as far back as 2013 that I know of, and probably before that. So they've been fighting the fight, but they haven't been getting a lot of hearing, and they're getting a lot more hearing now that it can be attached to the program with COVID-19 vaccine. So I think it is reinforcing that.
Yeah. How worried are you though, about this whole system sort of starting to come undone?
I'm very worried. I don't know if it's specifically because of the limits of the COVID-19 program, but there have been, for example, it's been a bill proposed by Representative Paul Gosar to abolish VICP, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, not the COVID program. And I think that could hurt claimants as well as hurt our vaccine supply. So it was last Congress. I don't think it's been reintroduced yet, but I expect it to be reintroduced, and I don't know which way it'll go.
And why is that? Because he thinks that the immunity shield should be lifted entirely.
Exactly. And I think it's at least partly based on the kind of misinformation you've talked about.
Dorit, back to the basic question of can you sue pharmaceutical companies? And we mentioned RFK Jr. And in his ethics disclosure, as he's going through this process, what comes up is that he's getting legal fees and referral fees for people who may end up suing Merck for the Gardasil or the HPV vaccine, which prevents cervical cancer. Again, it's like you think you have it clear, and then luckily we have a lawyer that we get to ask, like, is there some loophole? Like, how is it that can still go on? How is it that he could be behind or referring cases to a law firm?
You're saying, Mark, RFK is saying in public, you can't sue vaccine makers, and that's a really bad thing, while he as an attorney is suing vaccine makers.
I mean, I wish that's what I said, but yeah, I didn't say it that way. But yes, that's exactly it.
He's been suing them since 2016. And in 2023, 2024, when he talked to Congress, he told a congressional hearing that vaccine manufacturers for childhood vaccine have zero liability while he's engaged in this lawsuit. I think that is being less than fully honest here.
There is a way that you still can sue.
Yes, you can.
Yes, you can sue. He's litigating. There are over 200 cases right now against Merck over its Gardasil vaccine that are heard by a federal court. One case in state court that's went through a jury trial this week. And he has been involved in that litigation. So Mr. Kennedy certainly knows that it's happening and certainly knows that you can sue vaccine manufacturers.
I mean, I think it's a class action suit, and I think it's like a trial that's starting.
Yes, so there's two lines. One is the state case, Jennifer Robbie versus Merck, which has been in jury trial this week. I don't know how it ended because there hasn't been any resolutions that I've seen, but it's this week in jury, last week in jury trial. And then there's about 200 cases before that have been consolidated to what's called the multi-district litigation in one federal court that are going through the process.
Got it. Well, listen, I'm really glad we had Dorit here to help us unpack some of this. You know, it is, like I said, a question that has come up in numerous conversations we've had. It continues to come up. And I think it's just important that we know the facts. And if folks are listening who feel like something wasn't addressed, you know, do write us at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. I want to thank Dorit Reiss very much for joining us. I'm Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. She's Maggie Bartlett. He's Dr. Mark Abdul-Malik. Please click like, click subscribe, rate, review, all that good stuff, and we'll see you next week.